traveller to the quiet hours where history whispers its most intimate tales. Tonight in the Candlelight Historian, we journey not just through a single night, but through the long, agonizing passage of many months into the heart of a city besieged by an invisible enemy. It is London, caught in the terrifying grip of its last great plague, an ordeal that stretched from the uncertain spring of 1665 to the exhausted relief of 1666. Our companion on this vigil is Arthur Bailey, a parish watchman in St. Olave's, a husband and a father, a man who walked the desolate streets as his city and his own family were irrevocably changed by pestilence and loss. His story is one of quiet duty, profound grief, and the enduring strength of the human spirit against a backdrop of unimaginable sorrow, but also a chronicle of a city where desperation and opportunism walked hand in hand with fear and piety. Let the echoes of London's ordeal guide you into the stillness of these reflective hours. Part 1, The Creeping Dread, Spring Early Summer, 1665. The year 1665 dawned upon London, a sprawling city, a vibrant, chaotic warren of timber-framed houses and narrow, bustling streets thrumming with life. But whispers had begun to arrive with the merchant ships from the Levant, and Holland whispers of pestilence stirring once more in continental ports. In poorer parishes like St. Gazinthefield's, a few unusual deaths were noted in the cold days of late winter, but these were initially dismissed. Arthur Bailey, a watchman in the densely packed parish of St. Olave, Hart Street, near the formidable Tower of London, went about his nightly duties concerned with fire, theft, and keeping the king's peace. His household was a modest one, shared with his wife Sarah, a practical woman whose nature was increasingly shadowed by a quiet, persistent anxiety. Their family had already known sorrow. Their bright, inquisitive 8-year-old son Samuel had been taken by a swift and brutal fever the previous autumn, leaving an indelible mark of grief. Samuel's small, empty space in their lives was a constant, aching reminder of life's fragility. Their surviving children were Martha, now a girl of 15, now matured by loss, assisting Sarah with household chores and the care of her younger siblings. Thomas, at 11, was a sensitive lad, more prone than his siblings to chesty coughs that now caused Sarah sharp maternal fear. He missed Samuel keenly. The youngest, Elizabeth, whom they called Lissy, was 6. She sensed the undercurrents of worry, often asking when Samuel was coming back, questions that pained her parents. Through the early months of 1665, unsettling rumours from continental ports like Amsterdam and Hamburg seeped into London. Tales of virulent pestilence were at first dismissed by many Londoners with stoic indifference or willful denial. London had known plague before, but these whispers felt more ominous. By late April and early May, the bills of mortality showed a subtle but disturbing increase in fatalities under vague headings like ague, fever, or spotted fever, especially in poorer, overcrowded parishes. Outside the ancient city walls, Arthur heard hushed conversations in watchhouses and alehouses, a mix of bravado and ill-concealed fear. The city authorities initially offered cautious reassurance to prevent panic that might disrupt trade and civic order. But as May progressed, the numbers on the bills continued to climb inexorably. The unmistakable signs of bubonic plague, sudden high fever, agonizingly painful swellings or buboes in the groin, armpits or neck, and dark, telltale tokens signaling imminent death were reported with, quote, increasing frequency. One day, on his patrol near Drury Lane, just beyond the city's western boundary, Arthur saw it himself, a crude red cross, a foot in length, daubed upon a bolted door, with the hastily painted words, Lord have. mercy upon us beneath it. The sight sent a chill of dread. Through him the plague was here, at their gates, and beginning to creep within. The wealthy and the well-connected, privy to the true extent of the danger, began a quiet but steady exodus from the city. Coaches piled high with belongings, often travelling under the cover of darkness, rumbled over cobblestones towards country estates. Arthur witnessed this flight on his nightly rounds, noting darkened windows of substantial merchant houses in his parish. Their occupants vanished. This silent departure of the privileged did not go unnoticed by those who remained. The artisans, the labourers, the shopkeepers, the countless poor who had no option of escape. Unease, and sometimes resentment, began to simmer beneath the city's surface. Tales circulated of fleeing families refused entry into other towns, or set upon by desperate highwaymen. Arthur's duties as a watchman shifted subtly, then more dramatically. Parish constables, under pressure from the Lord Mayor and aldermen, issued new, stringent orders. Watchmen were to be especially vigilant for unreported sickness, listen for unusual cries or lamentations from within houses, and immediately report suspicious deaths. Arthur was now required to assist in the shutting up of infected houses. Once plague was confirmed, a household was sealed, its inhabitants, sick and healthy alike, confined within for 40 days. A guard posted outside to ensure no one entered or left. It was a terrifying prospect to be entombed with the dying, and Arthur dreaded the day he might be assigned such a post. The old camaraderie of the watch frayed, replaced by wary distance, each man acutely aware that his colleague, or indeed himself, could be a carrier of the invisible death. Arthur found himself looking at his fellow watchman with a new, unwelcome suspicion. At home, Sarah redoubled efforts to ward off the encroaching pestilence, her small house constantly filled with the pungent aroma of vinegar, which she used for washing, and the smoke of burning herbs, rosemary, rue, and dal, wormwood. She insisted the children carry posies of herbs when they ventured out. The memory of Samuel's rapid decline was a constant spur to her vigilance. Every cough from Thomas, every slight complaint from Lissy or Martha sent a jolt of fear through her. Arthur and Sarah had long, hushed, strained conversations after the children were in their beds. The question of sending the children away to Sarah's sister in the Essex countryside was revisited, agonized over. But her sister's husband, a farmer, had written back expressing deep reservations. His own small community terrified of anyone arriving from plague-stricken London. The roads were said to be dangerous, and the cost of such a journey and of supporting the children from afar was a significant obstacle. Arthur's wages were modest and irregular even in normal times. And now, with the city's economy beginning to seize up, their financial situation felt more precarious than ever. Food prices were climbing. Each evening, as Arthur prepared to leave for his patrol, the weight of these anxieties settled upon him. His love for his family was a fierce, protective ache. His duty was to them to provide, to protect, to somehow see them through this encroaching darkness. He would step out into the twilight, his lantern casting a flickering, uncertain light, his staff held tight in his hand. The familiar streets of his beat were taking on a new, alien aspect. The usual symphony of London night sounds was being gradually replaced by a more sombre soundscape. The tolling of a single church bell, the creak of a shutter blowing in the wind, the distant, muffled sound of a cough from behind a closed window, and an unnerving, spreading silence. The air itself seemed to change, no longer carrying the rich, complex smells of a living city, but instead a faint, almost metallic tang, sharp and unsettling, The smell, Arthur began to think of fear itself, a city holding its breath against a creeping, invisible dread. Part 2. The Reign of Terror, High Summer to Autumn 1665. As the summer of 1665 advanced, it brought with it not the customary warmth and languor, but a suffocating, dry heat that seemed to bake the very stones of London and provide a fertile breeding ground for the pestilence. The Great Plague, no longer a creeping dread, exploded with horrifying ferocity, tightening its grip on every parish, every street, every household. The carefully compiled figures in the weekly bills of mortality, once a source of anxious speculation, became a stark, undeniable testament to the unfolding catastrophe, the numbers climbing from hundreds into the thousands, then many thousands, each week. August and September were the cruelest months, the apex of the contagion, when the city seemed to surrender to a reign of terror, governed by the whims of an invisible, merciless tyrant. King Charles II and his court had long since decamped to the cleaner air of Oxford, their departure signalling to many the abandonment of the capital to its fate. The Royal Exchange stood silent, its merchant stalls deserted. The Inns of Court were empty, lawyers and judges having fled. For those who remained, the vast majority, it was a time of unimaginable trial in a city that felt like a vast, open tomb. Arthur Bailey's nightly patrols transformed from a watch against common crime into a harrowing journey through a city dying on its feet. The once teeming thoroughfares like Cheapside, Fleet Street and Gracechurch Street, where the din of commerce and human interaction was once a constant roar, were now often entirely deserted, save for the occasional pom-pom. Furtive figure scurrying through the shadows, or the grim procession of the dead cart. The silence that enveloped these grand streets was profound, unnatural, broken only by sounds that amplified the horror. The incessant, mournful tolling of church bells, no longer for individual souls, but as a general lament for the dying city. The sudden, piercing shriek of a delirious victim from an upper window, the low, agonized moans that seeped from behind sealed doors, or the hoarse, repetitive cry of the bearers, "Bring out your dead!" Arthur learned to dread these sounds, yet they became the grim soundtrack to his existence. Red crosses, once a shocking novelty, now seemed to adorn almost every other door, sometimes whole rows of houses in a street. Beneath them, the desperate plea, "Lord have mercy upon us," seemed a fading, futile scrawl against the implacable advance of the disease. He passed houses where, just weeks before, he had exchanged a civil word with the master or a nod with the servant. Now, they were sealed tombs, the silence from within often more terrifying than any cry. He knew the grim reality. Within those plague-stricken homes, the healthy were imprisoned with the sick, an almost certain death sentence for many. The parish authorities, overwhelmed and understaffed, appointed watchmen to guard these houses, to prevent any from breaking quarantine. Sometimes this grim duty fell to Arthur himself for a part of his beat, standing guard outside a house where he knew a family was slowly succumbing, listening to the muffled sounds of their suffering, a task that tested his composure to its very limits. The city's air, already heavy with the smoke of countless coal fires, grew thick and fetid with the smells of the plague. Bonfires blazed at many street corners, as ordered by the Lord Mayor, fed with wood, coal, pitch, and sometimes strongly scented substances like juniper or brimstone, in the belief that their pungent smoke would purify the corrupted atmosphere. The reality was that these fires often added to the choking pollution, their acrid smoke stinging Arthur's eyes and throat, doing little to halt the relentless spread of death. Mingled with the smoke was the sickly sweet, cloying odour of putrefaction, a scent that seemed to emanate from the very ground, from the overflowing churchyards and the hastily dug plague pits that served as mass graves. People carried posies of herbs pressed to their noses, or chewed on angelica root or tobacco, desperate for any defence. Arthur, too, carried such a posy, though he had little faith in its efficacy against so potent an enemy. In this atmosphere of overwhelming dread and societal breakdown, the darker aspects of human nature began to surface with greater frequency. Arthur, on his rounds, saw evidence of this decay. He heard whispers, and sometimes saw the grim results of plague nurses who were accused of hastening the deaths of their charges to pilfer their belongings. He came across houses that had clearly been broken into, their contents ransacked. The dead themselves were not safe. He patrolled near churchyards where the earth was frequently disturbed, not just by the constant digging of new graves, but by shadowy figures seen at odd hours, ghouls, grave robbers, stripping the dead of their shrouds, or any small valuables they might have been buried with. Arthur would chase them off when he could, his staff raised in anger and disgust, but they were like rats, scurrying away into the darkness, only to return when the coast was clear. This desecration of the dead, this preying upon the most vulnerable, filled him with a cold fury, a sense of a world turned upside down. He also witnessed strange, unsettling public displays of religious fervour and desperate superstition. One night, in a small square near Billingsgate, he came across a small group of men and women, their faces gaunt and eyes wild, engaged in a bizarre, convulsive dance around a smoking bonfire, chanting hoarsely. Arthur recognized it as a desperate, untutored plea for divine intervention, a raw outpouring of fear that had tipped into a kind of madness. He did not interfere, merely watched from the shadows, a profound sadness settling upon him. Elsewhere, he saw crudely drawn symbols chalked on doors, not the official Red Cross, but twisted, arcane shapes, remnants of older pagan beliefs resurfacing. Charlatans and quacks proliferated, preying on the terrified populace, selling worthless plague waters, amulets, and infallible preventatives at exorbitant prices. Arthur saw their hastily printed bills posted on walls, promising cures that never materialized, their greed a sickening counterpoint to the city's suffering. The weight of his own family's safety pressed upon Arthur constantly. Sarah, with her dwindling supplies, fought to keep their small household fortified. Martha, ever watchful, rationed their food and water with a strictness that belied her youth. Lissy, now almost permanently confined indoors, drew pictures on scraped pieces of parchment, pictures of a sun that shone brightly, of birds in flight, a child's yearning for a world she barely remembered. But it was Thomas, their quiet, cough-prone son, who became the focus of their most intense fears. In the brutal heat of late August, when the plague was at its zenith, Thomas's cough worsened. He complained of a headache, then a shivering chill despite the oppressive warmth. Arthur and Sarah exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated terror. They knew the signs. They had seen them with Samuel. They tried to nurse him in secret, isolating him in their small upper room. Sarah sat with him day and night, bathing his fevered brow, trying to coax sips of water or broth between his cracked lips. Arthur, when he returned exhausted and heartsick from his patrols, would relieve her, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he tried to comfort his son. The dreaded buboes appeared, dark and swollen, under Thomas's arm and in his groin. His fever raged, and he drifted in and out of a terrifying delirium, sometimes calling out for Samuel, sometimes crying for the pain. Arthur felt a helplessness that was a physical torment, a corrosive acid eating away at his spirit. He was a watchman meant to protect, yet he could not protect his own son from this invisible destroyer. The 40-day quarantine rule loomed over them. If discovered, their house would be shut up, a red cross painted on their door. Arthur himself potentially confined with them, unable to earn even the pittance that kept them from utter starvation. For 3 agonizing days and nights, they fought a losing battle. Martha, her face a pale mask of grief, took charge of Lissy, keeping her away from the sick room, trying to distract her with quiet games and stories, though her own heart was breaking. On the 4th morning, as a sickly, plague-ridden dawn filtered through the grimy window, Thomas's laboured breathing grew shallower, then ceased. He died quietly, his small hand clasped in Sarah's, Arthur standing helplessly by, the silence in the room suddenly vast and unbearable. The loss, so soon after Samuel, was a devastating blow. It felt as if the foundations of their world had crumbled. Arthur's grief was a cold, hard knot in his chest. There was no time for the rituals of mourning, no solace to be found in communal bereavement. With a heavy heart, he performed the terrible, necessary task. He wrapped Thomas's frail body in one of their few remaining clean sheets. Under the cover of the deepest night, avoiding his own usual patrol route, he carried his son's small, precious burden through the deserted back alleys, his footsteps echoing with a dreadful finality. He found the dead cart making its slow, creaking progress down a nearby street, its calloused bearers indifferent to his personal anguish. The transaction was swift, brutal, anonymous. Another small bundle added to the growing pile. He turned away, stumbling back towards his home. The image of that cart and what it contained burned into his soul. He returned to a house filled with a silence that was now the silence of a double bereavement. A silence that seemed to mock his efforts, his duty, his very existence. Sarah was prostrate with grief, Martha trying to comfort her, while Lissy, finally understanding that Thomas, like Samuel, was not coming back, wept with a child's raw, uncomprehending sorrow. Arthur could only stand and watch, his own heart a hollow, aching void. The reign of terror had breached their walls and claimed another part of their souls. Part 3. The long winter of grief. Late autumn 1665, spring 1666. As the last diseased leaves of autumn fell from the city's plane trees, a new antagonist began to assert its dominion over London, a bitter, unrelenting cold. The winter of 1665 to 1666 arrived with a vengeance, bringing with it the Great Frost, one of the most severe in memory. The Thames itself, that great artery of London's commerce, reportedly froze solid in places, a rare and astonishing sight, its surface transformed into a desolate, icy plain. For the citizens who had survived the plague's fiery breath, this new, frigid reality brought a different kind of suffering, yet also, paradoxically, a glimmer of hope. It was widely observed and recorded in the dwindling numbers of the bills of mortality that the intense cold seemed to suppress the pestilence. The weekly death toll, which had numbered in the many thousands at its peak, began to fall dramatically, from thousands to hundreds, then to mere dozens. The relentless, invisible enemy was, it seemed, finally retreating, driven back not by human artifice or prayer, but by the brutal, cleansing power of frost and ice. The historical record tells us of the city's suffering, but to understand the soul of a man living through it, let's hear from Arthur himself.
My heart a frozen landscape of grief after the loss of Samuel and then young Thomas. I continued my nightly patrols through this transformed city. London under the Great Frost was a place of stark, crystalline beauty and profound desolation. The narrow streets and alleys of my beat in St. Olivet's were often sheeted with ice, making my footing treacherous. My breath plumed white in the frigid air, and the small flame in my lantern seemed to offer even less warmth and light against the biting winds that howled down from the north, rattling shutters and creaking the ancient timber brow. Frames of the houses. The silence of the city was different now. It was no longer the tense, fearful silence of imminent death that had characterized the plague summer, but a deeper, more hollow quiet. The silence of emptiness, of absence. So many houses stood entirely vacant, their windows like the vacant eyes of skulls, their occupants long since carried to the plague pits. The red crosses on the doors were often encrusted with frost, their dire warnings muted by the ice. The once ubiquitous bonfires had mostly died out, their fuel exhausted or their purpose deemed less urgent as the plague waned. The cold, however, brought new miseries. Food, already scarce due to the disruption of trade and agriculture by the plague, became even harder to procure. The frozen river meant fewer supply barges could reach the city's quays. Farmers in the surrounding countryside, their own communities often ravaged, had little surplus to send. Prices for basic necessities like bread, cheese, and dried fish soared. But it was the scarcity of fuel, firewood, and coal that became the most pressing torment for many. The city's poor, already weakened by months of fear, malnutrition, and grief, now faced the prospect of freezing in their own homes. I, on my rounds, would see the desperate measures people took. I saw groups of shivering children, their faces blue with cold, huddled in doorways, trying to glean some warmth from each other. I witnessed arguments, sometimes vicious and desperate, breaking out over a few scavenged pieces of wood. The once communal parish woodpiles were long gone, and tales circulated of men venturing into Epping Forest, miles away, risking encounters with wolves or desperate outlaws just to gather faggots. Desperation born of cold and hunger fueled a new wave of grim opportunism. While the grand-scale looting of plague-emptied houses had perhaps diminished with the initial panic, a more insidious thievery took its place. I would find the doors of shut-up houses, where all inhabitants were known to have perished, prized open. Their interiors ransacked not for great valuables, but for anything that could be burned for warmth-broken furniture, floorboards, even wooden panelling torn from the walls. I once disturbed a gaunt, shadowy figure trying to strip lead from the roof of an abandoned church outhouse, presumably to sell for a few pence to buy food. The man, when confronted, had only stared back with eyes so hollowed by suffering that I felt a pang of wretched pity rather than anger, and let him slink away into the darkness. The line between victim and perpetrator had become blurred in this city of extreme want. Even the plague pits themselves were not entirely safe from desecration, as rumours persisted of the poorest of the poor, driven mad by cold and starvation. Attempting to dig for clothing or any scrap of value from the frozen earth covering the mass graves, a truly horrifying thought that made my stomach churn. Strange beliefs and desperate rituals also persisted, adapting to the new reality of winter. With the plague's retreat, the overt, frenzied public displays of religious terror lessened, but were replaced by a more secretive, almost furtive seeking of supernatural aid or scapegoats. I sometimes came across unsettling signs, small, crudely made effigies left at crossroads, perhaps intended to represent the plague itself, pierced with pins or partially burned. I heard of self-proclaimed prophets and astrologers who had survived the summer's cull, now offering new interpretations of God's wrath, linking the frost and famine to new sins or impending dooms, their pronouncements finding fertile ground in the minds of a populace traumatised and desperate for answers. One particularly cold night, I stumbled upon a small, clandestine gathering in a derelict warehouse near the river. Through a crack in the boarded-up window, I saw a handful of people, their faces illuminated by a single guttering candle, huddled around a woman who seemed to be in a trance, chanting in a low, guttural voice, her listeners hanging on her every word, their expressions a mixture of fear, desperate hope. I did not understand the words, but the atmosphere of intense, fearful superstition was palpable. I moved on quickly, not wanting to involve myself, but the scene lingered in my mind, a testament to the strange paths human belief could take when pushed to its limits. My own family's survival through that long, bitter winter was a daily struggle. Sarah, though her spirit was burdened by the loss of 2 sons, displayed a remarkable fortitude. She mended and remended our warm clothing, her fingers often stiff with cold. She concocted thin stews from the meanest scraps of vegetables and, on rare occasions, a piece of salt fish that I managed to buy or barter for. Martha, now 16, shouldered much of the household burden, her youth seemingly consumed by the endless tasks of fetching water, a chore made harder when pumps froze, seeking out fuel and caring for Lissy. Lissy, now 7, was a quiet, pale child. Her world shrunk to our cold, dim rooms. She rarely laughed, and her large eyes seemed to reflect the pervasive sadness of our home. I would return from my freezing patrols, my own body numb with cold, to find them huddled together for warmth, their faces lit by the faint glow of a tiny, carefully hoarded fire, if we had one at all. I would share my meagre earnings, and any news I had gathered from the streets, news of which bakery still had flour, or where a load of firewood might be found. My presence, though I often felt a failure for not being able to provide more, was a comfort to them, a bulwark against the desolation outside our door. The memory of Samuel and Thomas was a constant, unspoken presence in our small circle. Their absence felt most keenly in the hungry silences and the empty spaces where their laughter used to be. I found my own solace not in grand pronouncements of faith from the pulpits, for many churches were still closed, their priests dead or fled, but in the small, fierce love that bound my remaining family together, a fragile warmth against the overwhelming cold of the world.
Part 4. The Scars and the Dawn. Summer to Autumn, 1666. As the harsh winter of 1665 to 1666 reluctantly loosened its icy grip, and a pale, watery spring sun began to warm the scarred face of London, the Great Plague, which had terrorized the city for more than a year, at last began its definitive retreat. The weekly bills of mortality, once the harbingers of doom, now brought tidings of hope, however cautious. By the early summer of 1666, the number of deaths attributed to the pestilence had fallen to such a low as to be almost negligible, lost amidst the usual count of everyday mortalities from Kral. Consumption, fevers, and old age. In July, the king and his court, along with many of the gentry and wealthy merchants who had fled at the plague's onset, began to return to the capital. Their coaches, once laden with goods for escape, now trundled back into a city that was both familiar and terrifyingly altered. London was waking from its nightmare, but it was a changed city. For a watchman who had patrolled its darkest hours, every street held a ghost. Here is Arthur in his own voice.
For me, still faithfully walking my nightly beat in St. Olave's, this slow reawakening was a strange and sombre spectacle. The immediate terror had passed, but the city was a ghost of its former self, haunted by nearly 100,000 souls lost. London, in the summer of 1666, was a city of profound absences. So many houses stood empty, their doors still bearing the faded red crosses, their windows dark and accusing. Grass grew in the crevices of one's busy thoroughfares. The incessant clamour of commerce, the street cries, the rumble of carts, all were muted, subdued. Shops reopened tentatively, their shelves sparsely stocked, their owners often new to the trade, having inherited businesses or taken over abandoned premises. Taverns, too, began to unlock their doors, but the boisterous laughter and drunken singing of old were replaced by hushed conversations, men speaking in low tones, their eyes often carrying a haunted look. Fear lingered like a persistent miasma. A sudden cough in a public place could still cause people to flinch and draw away. Any rumour of a fresh outbreak, however small, sent ripples of anxiety through the populace. The plague had burned itself out, but its shadow remained, long and dark. My duties as a watchman began to shift once more. While vigilance against the plague was still a concern, the more pressing issues now were those of a city struggling to regain its footing. With so many empty houses, break-ins and squatting by desperate homeless individuals became more frequent. The economic devastation meant widespread poverty, and with it, an increase in petty theft. I found myself dealing less with the grim protocols of plague containment and more with the familiar, if now more desperate human frailties of a struggling populace. My patrols took me past newly reopened businesses, and I would exchange quiet, sombre greetings with proprietors I had known before the plague, or with new faces trying to make a start amidst the ruins of other lives. I saw children, thinner and more subdued than I remembered children being, playing tentatively in the quiet lanes, their games often strangely echoing the grim realities they had witnessed, games of plague and nurses or burying the dead. My own family bore the deep scars of their losses. The small house in St. Olave's felt unnaturally quiet without the boisterous presence of Samuel and Thomas. Sarah, though she had regained some of her physical strength, carried her grief in the stoop of her shoulders and the sadness that rarely left her eyes. She found solace in her meticulous care of their home, in her unwavering faith, and in her fierce, protective love for her surviving daughters. Martha, now a young woman of 17, had shouldered burdens far beyond her years. The plague had stolen much of her youth, replacing it with a grave maturity. She managed their household with a quiet efficiency, her resourcefulness having been honed in the desperate months of scarcity. She had found occasional work as a seamstress, her fine needlework helping to supplement my irregular wages. Lissy, at 7, was a child of the plague. Her earliest clear memories were of confinement, of hushed voices, of fear, and of the unexplained absence of her brothers. She was a quiet, observant child, prone to moments of sudden sadness, yet also possessing a child's remarkable capacity for resilience. Finding joy in small things, a rare flower pushing through the cobbles, A story her father told, the warmth of Martha's hand in hers. I watched my city and my family with a weary, compassionate gaze. I had walked through the very depths of London's despair, and I knew the cost of survival. I felt a profound sense of dislocation. The London I had known, the city of my youth and early manhood, was gone, replaced by this emptier, sadder, more cautious place. I too was changed. The easy camaraderie I once shared with my fellow watchmen was now tempered by a shared memory of horror. The simple pleasures of life, once taken for granted, now seemed precious, fragile things. Yet, amidst the sorrow, there was also a stubborn refusal to surrender entirely to despair. I saw it in Sarah's gentle tending of a small window box where she grew a few herbs, in Martha's determined stitching, in Lissy's occasional tentative laughter. I saw it in the city itself, in the slow, painful effort to clear away the debris of the plague, to reopen channels of trade, to rebuild shattered lives. Then, in the early hours of Sunday, the 2nd of September, 1666, a new alarm shattered the fragile peace of the recovering city. I was near the end of my watch, the sky just beginning to grey in the east, when I first saw the ominous red glow in the sky towards Pudding Lane, near London Bridge. A fire had broken out in a baker's shop. At first, it seemed like many other fires that periodically afflicted the densely packed, timber-built city, but this was different. A strong easterly wind was blowing, and the preceding summer had been long and dry, leaving the wooden houses tinder dry. The fire, starting small, quickly took hold, leaping from house to house with terrifying speed. I, along with other watchmen and the first waking citizens, rushed towards the blaze, but we were equipped with little more than leather buckets and primitive hand-pump squirts, utterly inadequate against the growing inferno. For 4 days and nights, the Great Fire of London raged, a monstrous, roaring beast that consumed everything in its path. I found myself in the heart of a new kind of chaos, one of smoke and roaring flames and collapsing buildings, and the terrified flight of a populace once again driven from their homes. My watchman's duties were now to try and guide people to safety, to help salvage what few goods could be rescued, to prevent looting that quickly broke out in the confusion, and to assist the beleaguered efforts to create fire breaks by pulling down houses with hooks and ropes, or even by using gunpowder to blast clearings, often too little, too late. The heat was intense, the air thick with choking smoke and a constant rain of embers. The noise was deafening, the roar of the flames, the crash of falling timbers, the cries of the dispossessed, the explosions of gunpowder. I saw familiar streets, my own well-trodden beat, transformed into impassable rivers of fire. I witnessed the destruction of St. Paul's Cathedral, its mighty stone walls cracking in the heat, its lead roof melting and pouring like silver streams into the streets below, its ancient timbers consumed in a colossal pyre. The sight of that great church, the spiritual heart of London, succumbing to the flames, filled me with a sense of profound desolation, almost as great as that I had felt during the peak of the plague. My own small house in St. Olivier's, by a stroke of fortune and a shift in the wind at a critical moment, was spared the main conflagration, though the threat came terrifyingly close. I managed to get Sarah, Martha and Lissy to relative safety in the fields of Moorfields, north of the city walls, where tens of thousands of homeless Londoners huddled in makeshift camps, watching in horror as their city burned. The scenes there were of immense suffering and confusion, families separated, their life's possessions lost, facing an uncertain future with only the clothes on their backs. Yet, even amidst this new disaster, I saw acts of kindness, people sharing what little food or shelter they had. When the fire finally burned itself out, Deterred by the wider brick-built areas in the west, the efforts of the Duke of York's men, and the dying of the wind, it left behind a scene of almost unimaginable devastation. More than 13,000 houses, nearly 90 churches, and countless public buildings were destroyed. The ancient medieval heart of London was a smoking ruin. Yet, as the smoke cleared and the city began to take stock of this new catastrophe, a strange, almost heretical thought began to circulate, whispered at first, then spoken more openly. The fire, for all its terrible destruction, had also acted as a great, albeit brutal, purifier. It had consumed the old, overcrowded, plague-ridden warrens of timber and thatch where the pestilence had thrived. It had scoured the ground clean. Many came to believe that the Great Fire, in its fiery baptism, had finally and definitively purged London of the Great Plague. I, standing amidst the charred ruins of streets I had walked my entire life, felt a complex mixture of emotions. Grief for what was lost, exhaustion from this new ordeal, but also, perhaps, a faint, weary affectation. Sense of an ending. The city had been doubly tested, by pestilence and by fire. Surely, now, it could begin to truly heal.
Arthur Bailey lived to see London begin its slow, arduous process of rebuilding. The years that followed the Great Fire were ones of immense labour and gradual transformation. A new city, of wider streets and more sober houses of brick and stone, began to rise from the ashes of the old. A city planned with a greater eye towards health and safety, though it would take decades for the vision to be fully realised. He continued his duties as a watchman, his presence a familiar and reassuring sight in a neighbourhood grappling with the practicalities of reconstruction and the lingering memories of all they had endured. The city was still full of scars, both visible and invisible. The plague pits remained, often unmarked, silent repositories of the uncounted dead. The open spaces where great swathes of housing had been consumed by fire were, for a long time, reminders of the fragility of urban life. His family, too, slowly found its way forward. Sarah, her grief for Samuel and Thomas acquired undercurrent to her days, poured her energies into creating a secure and loving home for Martha and Lissy. Martha, with her acquired resilience and skill as a seamstress, contributed significantly to their modest household, her quiet strength a testament to the generation that had come of age amidst such profound crisis. Lissy, the child who had survived both plague and fire, grew into a young woman who, though she carried the shadows of her early experiences, also possessed a determined spirit and a deep appreciation for the simple blessing of life. Arthur watched them, his heart filled with a mixture of sorrow for what had been lost and a quiet pride in what had endured. He never forgot the specific horrors of 1665, the eerie silence of the deserted streets, the ominous red crosses, the desperate cries in the night, the rumble of the dead carts, the gut-wrenching weight of his own son's body in his arms. Nor did he forget the terrifying roar of the Great Fire, the heat, the smoke, the chaos. These memories were woven into the fabric of his being, the testament of an ordinary man who had been an unwilling witness to extraordinary and terrible events. He had seen the depths of human despair and the heights of human courage. He had seen selfishness and exploitation, but also quiet acts of immense kindness and self-sacrifice. He had seen a city brought to its knees, its people decimated, its ancient heart consumed by flame. Yet he also saw it begin to rise again, stubbornly, resiliently. As Arthur grew older, his steps slower, his lantern perhaps passed to a younger man, He would sometimes sit by the river, looking out over the changing skyline of London. He was part of its history, a small, unassuming thread in its vast, complex tapestry. His story, like that of countless others who lived and died in those calamitous years, is a reminder of the enduring human capacity to face the unimaginable, to grieve, to adapt, and ultimately to rebuild. It is a story of the quiet heroism found not in grand pronouncements or epic battles, but in the steadfast performance of duty, in the unwavering love of family, and in the simple, profound act of surviving day by day, night by night, through the darkest of times. May the echoes of his long vigil, and the quiet strength of those who endured, bring a measure of peace to your own reflections. May the knowledge of their survival against all odds offer a gentle reminder of the resilience that lies within us all. And as you drift towards sleep, may your own small corner of the world feel safe, and your rest be deep and undisturbed.